I've been doing a few videos recently on ASP.NET Blazor and the distinction between Blazor WebAssembly and Blazor Server. Blazor WebAssembly, where everything is processed in the browser, and Blazor Server, when the processing is done back on the server. But what I'm going to talk about this week is a way to combine the two to solve quite a common problem in web development across all different technologies when you're doing SPAs, single page applications, the problem of the initial load. So let's have a look at what we mean by that. And so what I've got here is just a very simple Blazor WebAssembly application. And if I run that up, then we can see that when the page initially appears, we're getting that status display to show that the page is loading. Once the page is loaded, then we can navigate within it to the different tabs and that sort of thing. And that's very, very quick because all of that happens within the browser itself. So there's no more calls made to the server for that sort of thing to happen. But if we do something like a refresh, so we're navigating to it again, we have this wait of a few seconds and the indication that something's happening. And that's the problem that we get whether you're doing this sort of thing with Angular or with React.js or here with Blazor, that when you've got this idea of what they call a single page web application, it has this odd way of starting up. Because if we actually take a look at the page source, this is what was initially downloaded when we navigated to the site. So it's just a very simple HTML page with very little on it. Basically just there we've got the way that it was displaying that circle for the progress. But then the real trick that we've got here is that we're pulling in various scripts like the one we've got there and that one there. And that pulls in the whole of the Blazor WebAssembly framework that's required, plus it pulls in all of our DLLs that we've written in our particular application. But that's what slows it down, because this initial page is what we request. That comes down, and then that makes further requests for the other files, which then have to be pulled in, then have to do the processing within the browser, and only then does the page actually appear. So that's why we have those various steps and that delay. And although it's not an awful experience, sometimes it'd be nicer if you just immediately got what we're seeing here, the actual thing we have on the page. And with a server-side application, like written in something like MVC, that's exactly what would happen. But then, of course, with something like MVC, every request goes through that. So what we want is to have the very first view of the page processed on the server and delivered to us whole. And then after we've done that, have the client-side processing in WebAssembly. That is going to do the work for us. And it's a very common problem in all of these SPAs. If you're using something like React, then there's also a library called Next, which will help with this sort of thing. But we're going to see how we can do this with Blazor. Now, it's worth pointing out immediately one slight disadvantage to what we're going to do. If you look at this simple Blazor application, as I said, there's no server-side processing at all. All the web server does for an application like this is simply does what a web server did back 30 years ago. It just serves up files. So the browser requests the files, gets them, no processing on the server, so no high-powered computing needed, so it can be very much cheaper for hosting than what we're going to see here, where you do need some server-side processing. So what I'm going to do is do a new project, and this one is going to be a Blazor WebAssembly app again. So we'll click on that one, and I'll call this server-side startup. And then the really important thing I've got to do here is click that box there. Because if I didn't do that, I'd get exactly the same sort of project I had before, which is pure WebAssembly, only going to run in the browser. Putting this in here, we've now saying ASP.NET Core hosted. That is going to create a server project as well as the client-side project. And you can see we've got that there. So there is our server-side project. So everything in there is going to run on the server. Here we've got our client project, so that's what's going to run in the browser under WebAssembly. And one of the nice things about this, you can also have classes that are shared between the two, so that's what we've got in that separate library that we have there. Now, the reason initially that you do this sort of thing is typically if on the server you want to be running a web service that's going to give you data. And in fact, that's already configured here, because if you look on the server, you can see you've got the traditional weather forecast controller that you see in a lot of these applications. And that just gives us this weather forecasting. And something to just note while we're looking at that is the way this works is it randomizes the data. So the temperatures we get there are randomized. Remember that, because we'll see that later on. What I'm actually going to do here, though, is just to simulate the real world, when we'd be running on the internet, not just locally on my machine. Let's just put a delay in here so it's a little bit slow to get this data. So I'm going to turn that into an async task of all of that. And then we'll just in here say await task.delay, and then we'll make it 2 seconds. And the reason I put that in is just to show a further slight problem we get when we're doing rendering in the browser. That is, if I run that up again, then of course we still get the delay on startup and then finally get that. But if I go to this fetch data, you can see there's an additional delay. That's mostly due to that 2 seconds I deliberately put in, but it will still be there in the real world. And so if I actually do a refresh on this page, we get the one delay for downloading the application. And then once we're in there, we get the second delay of waiting for the data to come. So ideally, we like that page just to appear all there, all ready for us. So that's one of the things we're going to solve. So how do we go about doing this to make this so that we don't get that circle to indicate that we're waiting, we just get the data straight away? Well, there's a number of steps we've got to do that. First thing we have to do is, at the moment, the thing, as we said, that's being downloaded is this index page. So that's really what I was just showing you in the browser where we had the div for the loading progress and that sort of thing. We need to replace that by a server-side page. So in the server project, under pages, I'm going to give this a new Razor page, not a Blazor page, a Razor page. I'm going to have that as an empty one, and I'm going to call this underscore host. Call it what you like really, but that's quite a common thing to call it. And so we run that, we just get that basic Razor page in there. So remember, this is running server side. Then what I do is I go back to that index and I take the whole of that and paste it into this new CSHTML page that we've got there. And the only thing I need to leave in there is just the @ page at the top so that it knows it's a Razor page. And then I can also delete a couple of things. I can delete the index.html because we're going to be effectively generating that from our host. And then I'm also going to delete the code behind because we don't actually need any code here. So I can delete that as well just to simplify things there. So now this is going to be the page that has some server-side processing, but then gets delivered to the browser as a whole thing. So what we want to do there is, firstly, we just need to enable tag helpers. So if you're familiar with MVC, then you'll be familiar with tag helpers, but that's what we're going to do here. So I'm going to say add tag helper, and then I want all the tag helpers from Microsoft.ASP.NET.Core.MVC.tag helpers. So these are just the standard tag helpers that come with MVC. And then what I'm going to do is in here, I'm going to get rid of that loading progress, and I'm going to put in there a component. So we're going to use this idea of a component. So this is what we can do in server-side rendering. And that component is going to be of the type, and that's going to be type of, and then we're going to use the application component in the client-side application. So in the client-side application, you should see we've got this thing called app.razor, and that actually is the starting point for our site. So that is what we want to render, but server-side in here. So what we need to do is type of, and then just the fully qualified name. So that's going to be server-side startup.client.app. And so that's the thing that we're going to be rendering server-side. And then we're going to do the thing that's really the key to the whole of this. We are going to set a render mode, and that render mode is going to be WebAssembly pre-rendered. So does exactly what it says on the tin. This is what we're trying to do, pre-render it. So that's basically just saying do it the once on the initial load, but not then subsequently. So that's what we put in there. So this is going to run on the server and generate the entire of our first page as if it would be doing it when it runs on the browser normally. Got to do a little bit more there. We've also then got to go to the program, again the server program, and in here, if we just go down here, you can see that at the bottom here it's saying app.map fallback to file index.html. So that's saying that's what we should initially download, which of course we've just deleted because we don't want that anymore. So we change that not to map to a file, but to map to a page, because we're going to have to do some processing on here. And then we put in what we just had, which is going to be a / and then underscore host, the name of the file that we just wrote. One other thing we've got to do, just to avoid some errors, is if we go to the program in the client, you can see what it does there is it looks for a div with an ID of app. Well, that div we actually just deleted because back in the host, when, if I just Control Z that a bit, when we deleted all of the code that we had here, there is our div with the ID of app. So it's not going to be able to get hold of that anymore because we've basically replaced it by putting this in here. So we just need to remove that line of code. We can also get rid of that using as well in there. So that should really be all we need to do. So if we now run that up, then we can see that the page appeared immediately. And if I click refresh, you can see, although obviously it's still got some slight delay, it's not got the progress bar, it is just taking us straight there. And we can see that difference slightly more concretely because if we look at the page source, you can see the page that was actually delivered to it had the things we want. So you can see we've got the welcome to your new app, we've got all that sort of thing in there because that was generated on the server and that's what's been handed over. We do still, of course, have the various JavaScript files that we need for the WebAssembly because once it's delivered that initial page, all the other interactions are now occurring within the browser, so it's still got to download that as well. But it means it can display as the initial view and then download those things in the background rather than us waiting for those downloads before everything happens. There is, however, still a slight problem. If I go to the fetch data, now that one, we had the slight delay that I deliberately put in there when it was delivering the data on the server, but it still worked perfectly well because when I went there by navigating within the menu, that was still a client-side navigation. But the problem is if I refresh this, now what it's going to do is go back to the server, try and get the server to generate this page server-side and give it us back. And if we do that, we get this horrible error. And the reason is, you can make it out basically from what's happening in there, is that we haven't configured dependency injection. Because if you look at how that client-side page works, so here we are in the client project, go to fetch data, and we are using HTTP client to make that work, which is done with the injection of HTTP client, which is configured again in the client-side program, and you can see there that's where we're configuring it to work. But remember, this one is only run on the client side, so when that same page gets run for the pre-rendering on the server, it can't find the injection. So all we've got to do is remember to inject it in both. So we'll go to the original one and we'll copy that and then go to the server-side program and we'll just go up here and paste that in. We then hit a slight problem because this host environment only makes sense when we're doing Blazor WebAssembly because it's telling us what's happening on the backend server. We don't have it here, so we can't get the address. Now, there's lots of ways we could do this, but I'm going to really just do it in the slightly hacky way. I'm going to go to the launch settings and let's just get hold of that one there, which is the one we're using, and paste that in. So in a real application, you'd obviously have to have some way of configuring that, but for this quick demo, I'm simply going to get rid of that and put that in there. And now we have a server-side configuration for that injection. And so now if I run that up, obviously that all runs up okay. But now if we go to the fetch data, well, that works fine because that's the navigation within the browser. But the important thing is now if I do the refresh, then it takes a moment because we've got that 2-second delay still happening there. Obviously, we finally removed that. But then you see it did something a bit odd. Let's just watch that again. So it's delivered us directly the data, but then it does another loading, and then it gives us back, and in this case, some different data, and it's different data because of that randomization. So remember, the weather forecast is random each time, and the problem is we're requesting it twice. So we do the refresh, that requests it on the server, so gets the data from itself, puts that into the completed page. But then once the page has been downloaded, then all of our Blazor WebAssembly kicks off, and the code running in the browser makes another request for the data, and that's why we're seeing what happens there, that it initially loads it, we've got that first temperature of 17, and then it loads it again, and in this case we've got a completely different temperature. Now, in most cases, actually making two requests at approximately the same time within a second or two to a web service would give you back the same results. So the data wouldn't actually change, but it's still inefficient once you've already got the data to be wasting time getting it again. And this is something that was solved only as recently as .NET 6. So this is a fairly new feature that we've got in Blazor that can get us around that. So what we have to do is this. Firstly, we go back to that host page that we just created, and we add another tag helper, and that is called persist component state. So don't have to do anything special with that, it's just got to be there, and that just configures the system to do a few of the things that we need. Then what we need to do is go to the actual Blazor component that's causing the problem. So that is our fetch data.razor. And what I'm going to have to do is a couple of things. Firstly, I'm going to do another injection. So at inject, and then this is a thing called persistent component state. And so that's what we'll inject, and we'll just call that application state. So that's the way that we can do dependency injection in a Blazor component, and so that means we've now got an additional property that's generated there called application state. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to implement an interface, and that's simply going to be iDisposable, because we've got to do a little bit of tidying up after this. So then let's go down to the code. So all of that HTML can stay the same, but in the code we've got to do a few more things. So the next thing I'm going to do, after we have that array of weather forecasts that we're getting back here on the HTTP request, I'm going to put in there another class. It's going to be a private, and this one is called Persisting Component State Subscription. And we'll see what all these do once it all fits together. And let's just call this thing Persisting Subscription. And then in our onInitializeAsync, where we are loading the data from the web service, this is where we've got to make a decision. So we've got to discover whether that data has already been displayed as part of the pre-render, in which case we can just use the existing data again. We don't need to make the HTTP request. Or if we haven't had that data because we're navigating to this page within the browser rather than refreshing from the server, then we are going to need to get that data. So first thing I'm actually going to do is put in here a private method, return to task, and it is going to be called persist forecasts. And so this is where we are going to do the storage that we can retrieve later on. And it's very simple. We can just use that application state, which remember was the property that I just configured for injection. And from that, we can say persist as JSON. So the data we persist has to be something that's in a format that can be turned to JSON. And then we just pass in there the key that we're going to give it, just so we can identify it in future. So we'll call this weather data. So just any label that you want. And then the actual data, which is going to be our forecast. So that will store that information there for us. Notice this is returning a task, but we didn't have anything async to do. So we just have to say return and then task.completed task. So that just keeps that happy. Then the last thing we've got to do is in our onInitializeAsync, where we're getting that data, we then have that persisting subscription that I just created. And we initialize that to, again, using the application state. But this time we can say register on persisting, and then we give it that function that I've just written, that persist forecast. So that persist forecast isn't going to be called immediately. We're registering it so the application state can call it if necessary. And then having done that, we're going to say if, and then application state again, dot try take from JSON. So what we're doing here is trying to see whether we've had that data persisted. That then is a generic for the type of data that we're storing. So the thing that we persisted, forecasts, we know is this array of forecasts. So we'll put that in as the generic type so that it can deserialize it. Then the next parameter we have in there is the key. So that was the weather data that we had in there. And then as an out parameter, we can have the actual data we're fetching out, which we'll just give the name restored. So what we're doing here is we're basically saying if this persisters.json has been called, we'll get back a true from here and we'll be given that data that was stored. And so in that case, we can simply say forecasts equals restored. So just put that restored data into the forecasts. Otherwise, if it hasn't been stored, then we'll just do what we did before and we'll actually get the data. One final thing we've got to do there, which is we have to implement iDisposable, because remember, we declared that at the top. So we'll have a public void dispose. And then what we have to do with that is simply we've got to dispose this persisting subscription. So that is also iDisposable. So when the component is disposed, we've got to dispose that as well. Now let's run that up, see what happens. Obviously we get that there quickly. We go to the fetch data. That first one it did by going to the page in the browser and then calling the server. That's why we got the delay. But now let's see what should have changed. Now if I do the refresh, there we get the new data coming back, but that's it. That is now staying where it should be. It's not doing that second call and us seeing different weather forecast data and all of that. Let's just debug that a little bit so we can see what's going on. So all I'm going to do is put a break in the persist forecasts and a break in the on initialized async. And what we should see here, if we navigate to that page, then we're coming in here, doing the on initialized async, and when we try to get that data, there's no data there because we haven't done any server-side rendering. So we go and fetch the data and then we'll get, with a 2-second delay, that coming back. However, if I click refresh here, then we hit that, and the thing to remember now is this bit of code that we can see at the moment is running in the server. Okay, so this code is running in the server, and as we step around in that, we haven't got the data yet. So on the server, it calls its own web service to do that. And then, still on the server, and you can see we're still on the server because we're in there at the very root of it all, it takes the data and it converts it to JSON and persists it. And then that JSON data will be sent off with all of the other stuff down to the browser. Now if I do another continue, now we can see it's about to restart. So now on the browser, and you can see here in the stack, that's clearly running on the browser now as part of WASM. It's now that it comes into the on-initialize async, it has a look to see if it's got persisted data, and it has. So that restored data is the deserialization of the JSON data that was serialized by the server and sent along with everything else. And so there we've got our data displayed without the refresh. But if now we look at the page source, so this is what was generated on that first request by the pre-rendering, and look down here, there we've got the Blazor component state. So that is that weather forecast data. We'd said we'd encode it to JSON, but it's then further encoded to base 64 just to make it more compact. But that's where the client-side component reads the data from that it got back from that persisted application state. So quite a complicated set of steps there, but really quite an important one that you want to do. Otherwise, you'd have lots of these situations whenever you went to a page that made an HTTP request back to the server, it would deliver the initial data through the pre-rendering and then waste time and possibly have different results like we had here by making that second call. So quite a lot of things that we need to do there, but it's fairly straightforward. If you follow the steps and do all the things I've done there, then you will have got yourself a pre-rendered Blazor WebAssembly application. So I hope that was useful. If you enjoyed it, do click like, do subscribe, and I'll see you next time.